I'm going to start off today by talking to you about humans' capacity for language. Humans' capacity for language has fascinated psychologists and philosophers and now neuroscientists and others for centuries. It's a signature marker of being a human being. But very few of the original theorists studied babies and really looked at what was happening either behaviorally or in the brain. And so basically the brain is uncharted territory from the standpoint of an infant, but only now, and you'll hear today, how we're beginning to discover what's going on inside the infant brain as the baby is doing some work. There's great promise, I think, both from a science perspective and a practical application perspective. I think that understanding how the brain handles language is going to tell us as much about the human mind as just about any other area of study that we could do. So infants are phenomenal learners, but one of the things that we know about them is that there are also some constraints on learning. Timing can be everything. Early development is characterized by what biologists call a critical period. During critical periods, the environment has an enormously powerful impact on the brain's wiring, and during these periods of time, the brain can get literally rewired. Learning during the critical period is implicit. It happens automatically without conscious processing, and the learning that happens during this time tends to be fairly indelible. It stays with you your whole life. Before and after these periods, something puts the brakes on plasticity. So it's very important to know what kind of learning is happening during those windows of opportunity and what's putting the brakes on after. If we understand what happens during that learning window, we may be able to establish it later. So we know that language exhibits one of the most famous instances of a critical period. To read this graph, you find your age on the bottom of the graph and look at your skill level in acquiring a second language on the vertical axis. And as you can see, the babies are geniuses up to about the age of 7, and then there's a systematic decline. And after puberty, it's really quite difficult to master with complete facility a second language. Now, scientists don't dispute this curve. But we're all trying to figure out why it works in this way. Some scientists, early scientists, thought it was completely dependent on time, a maturational phenomenon. We've been arguing that learning itself changes the architecture of the brain, that neural commitment in the brain is affecting strongly your ability to learn later, and that neural architecture can make it more difficult to understand another language. The reason that we're very interested in the early period, this curve is actually representing a number of curves. There's phonetic learning takes place really early. There's a little, and that's the one we're going to focus on today. There's a little period early in development that is responsible for babies' mastering of the sounds. Later, there's ones for word and grammar learning, and we know less about them. We're going to focus on this early one because it's been such a stumbling block for second language acquisition by adults. It's been a stumbling block for machines, and it's very, very tractable. We can play out the whole scenario with regard to nature and nurture at this level. So it's also very important for developmental disabilities. This early period is when developmental disabilities take hold that involve language. So autism, Fragile X, specific language impairment, dyslexia, they all have to do with the language system. They all have to do with that period of early learning. So we think that this phonetic critical period will mirror the rest of language, so that's a very important one to understand. Our goal is to understand everything about it, how experience affects it, what opens it, what closes it, and what's the kind of learning, both behavioral demonstrations of that and the brain. Here's a fundamental finding that was important to theory. Psychologists had discovered that if you create a continuum of sounds that goes from ba to pa and you change it in equal steps, that adults were exquisitely sensitive at the boundary between the two categories. Hearing is better at that boundary between categories. In '71, Peter Imus at Brown demonstrated that was also true for babies. So babies show this exquisite sensitivity right at the boundary. And then in 1975, I demonstrated that that was true for other mammals. So monkeys and chinchillas also show that sensitivity at the boundary. Now, that was not a popular finding at the time, right? Chomsky and all the followers were arguing that evolution had nothing to do with language, whereas this turned that argument on its head and said that the basic components of language, bits and pieces of language, are deeply embedded in our evolutionary history. It doesn't take anything away from the baby. The fact that the baby has exquisite sensitivity there is fantastic. So 2 methods took us beyond that. One was a behavioral method, and we took this all over the world. In 8 countries, we did studies in which babies are sitting on a mother's lap and turning their heads when they hear a sound change. So a syllable like ba, ba, ba was playing. When pa came on, the baby had to be trained, turn your head because there's a 3-second opportunity to see the monkey in the box. So all over the planet, we were testing with many sounds of many languages and illustrating what came to be the phrase known as citizens of the world. Babies in the first 6 months of life are citizens of the world. They hear all the distinctions of all languages. You and I, all adults on the planet, are culture-bound listeners. We can no longer hear those distinctions. So this technique did a lot of work. And then later with EEG, over the last 15 years, EEG has been the brain method of choice for babies because they wear a cap in which you're looking at the electrical activity. There is a neural signature for speech discrimination. You play the ba, 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 change it to pa, and the deviant sound, the new one, creates a neural signature, a negativity that we can see quite easily called the MMN. Now, these studies have demonstrated one really important thing, which is, what is the critical period for sound learning? It's right here. Between 8 months and 10 months, a dramatic change occurs. We were in Tokyo and in Seattle for a collection of these data, head-turn data, but ERPs show the same thing. American and Japanese infants behave the same at 6 to 8 months, but 2 months later, something very dramatic occurs. They go from citizens of the world to this more culture-bound listener that we are. So clearly, we want to know what's going on during that little 2-month window. We know, and I won't show you the data, but I'll tell you that brain measures, very, very sensitive, taken right at the cusp of that learning at 7.5 months. You take a brain measure of native and non-native listening to sounds that are in the language and not in the language, it predicts language growth to the age of 3 and reading readiness at the age of 5. It's a very important transition that babies go through. The attentional mechanisms that allow them to grab onto the native sounds and give away, not pay attention to non-native sounds, leads to a growth process. So what's happening? What's critical during this critical period? There are 2 things that are critical. They're very different. One is computational and one is social. The computational piece is that we demonstrated in 1992 that babies are taking distributional statistics on the input they hear. Now, I'll illustrate that with a cartoon in a minute. You're going to hear 2 women, an American speaker of English and a Japanese speaker of Japanese, speaking motherese, which is mother's milk to the brain. Babies choose it if you give them a choice. They love listening to it. It exaggerates the distributional differences between the sounds. So let's listen to those 2 women speak.
I love your big blue eyes. So pretty and nice.
うわー、大きな茶色いお目目。そして綺麗な黒い髪。
Okay, so what babies are doing during that period is taking distributional statistics on input. We can show in the laboratory, mine and others, Jessica May in particular, that these distributional statistics are different for the 2 languages, and when babies hear those statistics, they behave like Japanese or American listeners. You can change in the laboratory and with very short exposures during the critical period to make them hear the distinction between R and L by giving them these bimodal distributions of sounds, or make them behave more like Japanese and do not hear the distinction between R and L if you give them distributions like on the right. So we asked ourselves, if babies are taking statistics on what they hear, this has also been shown for vision, and it's a little scary that babies are taking statistics on whatever you put in front of them, but they clearly are at this age. So we designed an experiment to see, can babies take statistics on a brand new language for the first time at 9 months? Maybe they have to build up these distributions over 9 months, and that's why they don't change perception until 9 months. So we expose the babies to a brand new language right at this critical moment at 9 months, giving them 12 sessions over a month and a half time. Here's what those sessions were like.
Jasper, 早安 Finn。嗨，我们要来讲一个故事哦。今天要讲的故事是《小熊七七探险记》。来看看发生了什么事情哦。小熊七七在这里，一个绿色的圈圈。绿色的圈圈，绿色的圈圈，转一下，转一圈，嘿，一圈，再一次哦，转1、2、3。
Okay, so what did we do to their little brains? We gave them 12 sessions of Mandarin for the first time. We had also run a control group that came in for 12 sessions but heard English. English exposure did nothing to Mandarin skills. This is a good thing for a scientist. But exposure to Mandarin changed everything. They became as skilled at the Mandarin sounds as the babies growing up in Taiwan and listening for 10 and a half months. So it was an incredible effect of experience. We then ran the following condition. Because the babies had changed so much, we exposed them over a television set. And we asked, does listening to, if it's just computational, it's rolling across the basilar membrane, the same change is going to occur. And we exposed other groups to auditory alone. What did we find? Auditory presentations, looking at a teddy bear on the screen, no learning whatsoever. Television exposure, absolutely no learning whatsoever, even though they were glued to the television screen. It takes a social stimulus for the brain to absorb its statistics. We extended this to Spanish. Here's what those sessions look like.
Te da un besito. Besito. Porque te quiere, ¿no? Con la boca te da un besito. Qué rico es el pan. Muchas gracias, Lucas. Mía. Dos, tres. Hola, ¿cómo estás? ¿Estás bien, Spencer? ¿Te gusta el pan? ¡Qué rico!
That's a little fatherese going on right there. So this established not only that it extended to Spanish, they learned the phonemes of Spanish, they learned the words of Spanish. We had 10 words that they heard and 10 words that they didn't. Moreover, a month after the sessions occurred, we brought the babies back in and let them listen, play on the floor, to a Spanish speaker and an American English speaker. And we showed that babbling changed differentially when they were in front of these two speakers, which means that the exposure not only changed the perceptual system for phonemes and words, it changed the motor system in a way that allowed it to be ready to differentially use those motor patterns for English exposure and Spanish exposure. Okay, so all of this is to motivate getting in the brain. iLabs created a brain team over the last 2 years, right after we had the MEG machine installed in 2010. And we've got 2 radiologists, a biophysicist, 2 engineers, and 3 neuroscientists working very strongly together. The core of it is magnetoencephalography, or MEG. For those of you who have never seen one of these, it looks like a hairdryer from Mars. The advantage is it's perfectly safe, non-invasive, harmless, it's noiseless. It's recording magnetic fields, not hemodynamic. It's reporting magnetic field changes which are minute as the cellular firing takes place. The excitement for us, it's picking up these magnetic fields with 306 squids, superconducting quantum interference devices that are lodged in the helmet, and reporting that tsunami of data to computers that are analyzing the results. Under the best conditions, you get a millimeter of accuracy with space and, of course, sub-millisecond accuracy with time. We're the first in the world, as I said, to put a baby in an MEG machine. And what's fun about it is we're tracking the baby's head with pellets in a little cap. So we always know where the baby is. The baby's free to move. This baby's listening to different language sounds through insert earphones so you can hear how quiet it is. The baby's free to move. And only when the baby really makes a kind of lurch do we have to X out those epochs. So what we're trying to do in a very large study now is look at adults, 6-monthers and 12-monthers in the MEG machine as they listen to 3 different sounds, a standard sound that is common to Spanish and English, and a Spanish deviant sound and an English deviant sound. So I want to show you what the brain team has accomplished over the last few months. We are integrating information from each subject. Every baby has an MRI, DTI, and MEG. So we can layer these into a 3D representation. There are going to be tons of details that you'll want to know. We've got the MEG lab open over the noon break, over the lunch break, and at 2 o'clock everybody will be in their stations. You can ask lots of questions about the movies I'm about to show you. So here is the result. This is Jeff, our adult monolingual subject. I won't show you bilingual data today, but we're gathering it. So free surfer parcellation of the brain, and then we're interested in these auditory areas, and I'm showing you superior temporal and middle temporal, and Broca's, opercularis, and triangularis. And of course, through tractography, the arcuate vesiculus, which is the major pathway linking auditory and motor areas. Now, you're seeing these bubbles, these clouds, are MEG activity. Time is at the bottom. You can see the 2 tracks. The red one is the auditory signal. reporting the strength of the current flow, and Broca's is the blue one. You can see it change over time for the English deviant, and then you're going to see the Spanish deviant, and then I'll put them all up together. What's interesting about this adult listener is that you see Broca's area much more active for the two deviant sounds. The standard repeats over and over again. It's when new sounds happen that you get Broca's activation. So we stopped this briefly at about 84 seconds just to see what's happening in Broca's. Nothing in this for the standard, but the two deviant sounds are activating Broca's quite actively. Okay, so now what does it look like to see a baby brain under that same scenario? All right, so here we go. Here's our 6-monther. There's the brain, again parcellated. It takes a lot of extra work with Free Surfer. There's a lot of in-house work done to create this kind of information, and you'll be able to see it at noon. So again, those 4 structures, auditory and Broca's, you can see the activation, the clouds coming on for the standard. Now the English deviant. Okay, in the baby, much more synchronized activity between auditory and motor, and more activity in general. And the Spanish deviant, a big burst of activity in the motor areas as the sound comes on. And what we see with the babies is, again, this tendency to be more active in Broca's than the adult, and especially for the Spanish deviant, the most unusual sound that the baby is listening to. Okay, so now let's take a look at the 12-monther. 12-monther brain, 4 areas. And very interesting arcuate, growing and connecting. You can see how turned it is. Again, the activity in Broca's is very, very big, bigger than in the adult, even for the standard. Very big for the English deviant. Explodes and time together. And the Spanish. So in the lab at noon, you're going to be able to rotate. It's in 3D. We've got the glasses and everything. So you can rotate the image and sort of see the clouds. They practically come out at you. So the grand plan here is to gather data on about 50 people at each age, 6 months, 12 months, and adulthood, and a comparable set of bilingual people. The bilingual brains we've looked at so far look very, very different, as you'd expect. Experience has changed them. In fact, we're convinced that the critical period for the babies has been extended by the variability created by listening to 2 languages. There are definite implications for autism here. We have a test that's a behavioral test that can be run as early as 15 weeks, showing that babies who are children who have been diagnosed with autism do not prefer to listen to motherese when given a choice between motherese and a non-speech analog. So briefly, listen to these 2 sounds. This is motherese.
Look what I have. Look what I have. It's a pot.
She says, look what I have, it's a pot. Here's the non-speech analog. We've shown a variety of studies that this is a very, very good predictor of the severity of autism symptoms. We're now using this as a potential marker in children who are siblings of children with autism, to see whether it can forward predict those who will be diagnosed with autism. We have other ERP markers, as you can imagine. These are both the phoneme measures and our word measures are extremely sensitive markers in autism. And the prediction in typical children, this will be too complicated to go over, but ERP data demonstrate that typically developing kids show a difference between known and unknown words at T3 on the left. Toddlers as a group with autism do not show this effect at all. But there's great individual variability. If you extract this measure at 2 years of age from the autism sample, the prediction ability at 2 years later and 4 years later is amazing. So among all of the measures we've taken in our cohort, cognitive, social, linguistic, this measure of word differences between known and unknown words taken at 2 years actually gets better over time, as both in cognitive, adaptive behavior, and receptive language. The predictions are quite stunning. Futuristic work will be with technologies that are social. The more social you make a robot, the more typically developing children will learn from it. This is a robot in a San Diego school in work I'm doing with Javier Movellen. The robot has become social by turning its head and giggling when you touch it, but it speaks Finnish. And the kids in a 2-week exposure in the daycare will learn Finnish words by playing with this robot. We think it'll be important not only for potential assisting second language learning, but with autism may be very potent because you can tone down the social factors that sometimes appear to be painful for children with autism. We're fascinated by the role that the social brain plays in learning, particularly in language, as I've illustrated today. This face-to-face neuroscience is something we hope to do in the future. We're collaborating with Harvard to try to get 2 MEG machines, 2 people and 2 MEG machines, communicating in a kind of Skype-type arrangement to see how their brains react to both being interacting. We're also in our own MEG laboratory linking a mother and her baby, the mother being in the ERP cap and the baby being in the MEG machine, co-registering the information and convincing the software that we've really got 2 brains here so that we can watch the social understanding system interact. As John mentioned in the beginning, this is the beginning of a social brain that is the best education vehicle we know of so far. So there's a lot of work represented here, and I just want to take a brief nod to the army of people who are helping do this work. It's a cross-disciplinary and cross-country collaboration. Thanks very much. Very excited about your comments.